Hello everyone and welcome to one more video in our series, How to Teach the Skills. Today we are going to look at speaking, how to teach speaking. The slides are courtesy of Professor Carlos. So first of all, we have to consider that we have some oral communication skills. After all, our students come to us because they want to learn how to speak the language. We do many other things and we teach them many other things, but at the end of the day, who doesn't want to speak? That's why they enroll in language learning programs. However, when we think about what to teach in terms of speaking, there are many things we should consider. For example, there is one thing which is conversational discourse. Our students need to be able to perform speech acts in regular conversations. So that's how we show that through speaking, language has been acquired. Students practice what they have acquired through speaking, and they show what they know through speaking. Another part of oral communication is teaching pronunciation. Remember, we had an entire video about pronunciation? Well, it is important to acquire an intelligible pronunciation. Nowadays, with the emergence of global English and Englishes, the concept of English as a lingua franca, we know that it's not necessary to sound British or sound American to be intelligible and comprehensible and to be able to communicate with other speakers. After all, we're going to have a very small possibility to speak with native speakers, but a very high possibility to speak with people from other languages. So English becomes a transactional language. Then we also should consider another aspect, which is accuracy and fluency. In 1970s, we started this movement of not to grammar. Is it necessary to teach grammar or isn't it? People started considering other options of practice and other options of communication as the way to teach, not only grammar-based or grammar structures. Also, there is another point called discrete item study, which is when we study items in language, small items in language. So, for example, prepositions, or we study sounds, or we study morphemes, very small components of the language, and we analyze those. And also, when we talk about accuracy and fluency, there's something related to the message-oriented use or language-oriented usage. So, what do we need language for? Do we need it to convince? Do we need it to persuade? Is it message-oriented? Or do we need to master certain aspects of the language in order to communicate certain functions? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves and that are going to shape the way we teach speaking in our class. Also, there is something very important, which are the affective factors surrounding the teaching of language, especially communication. Because students feel very anxious at the moment of speaking a foreign language. So anxiety and language ego are very, very big components and something that we have to consider. We need to create a pacific atmosphere where students know they can make mistakes. And as it says on the slide, we need to guarantee a non-threatening environment. Students need to be able to make mistakes, to feel at ease in the environment where we work. So that's why exercises like group work and pair work can really help those shy and introverted students feel more at ease because they don't have to be exposed to all the group. Then we also have another aspect in oral communication skills, which is the interaction effect. So what is the interaction effect? Language is interactive by nature. There is an interactive nature of communication. So students should be prepared to interact in the foreign language. That's why we need to provide opportunities for them to negotiate meaning. For example, give them some pictures and have them decide where to go on vacation. That would be a good activity for them to interact and to negotiate meaning. Students need to learn how to take turns, how to agree or disagree. That's why we have all these activities where we teach students to do these tasks. Also, the interlocutor effect. It is not the same if I'm talking to the computer, like what I'm doing right now, that if I'm talking to you in the classroom, because there will be questions, you will ask me stuff. The same happens when you are having a conversation. It changes if your interlocutor gives you feedback, asks you follow-up questions, or if it's just a passive listener. So all of these aspects are important when developing oral communication skills for our students. Let's think about the difficulties when speaking. Speaking is a very difficult task for some people because there are certain aspects like clustering, redundancy, reduced forms, and performance variables. So let's take a look at clustering, for example. Some students have a hard time understanding what they listen to or producing breath groups or linking. For example, students have a hard time with past modals, let's say when we have to say should've, could've, would've, you know. So that is linking when we join things together. So this presents a difficulty for students. It also redundancy. Redundancy presents difficulties for students when speaking because normally they tend to over-repeat things, right? Also, this is a normal feature of communication when we repeat things in different ways, let's say. But for students, it might be hard to understand because they think information has already been said. Why is it being repeated, or why is it being changed in a different way? Reduced forms, things like contractions, elisions, reduced vowels like schwa. These present difficulties for students in terms of comprehension. They might have a difficulty understanding this phenomena. And also performance variables like pause, hesitation, or fillers. You know, when you are at the beginning of your language learning process, you use a lot of vocal fillers. You say all the time. The more advanced you are in your process, the less fillers that you use because you know more words. So remember that it is important to think of all these difficulties when speaking and provide students with opportunities to overcome them. For example, we can help them overcome performance variables like fillers or hesitations by giving them tasks where they have to speak on the spot, like impromptu speaking. Some other difficulties that we can experience when speaking are, for example, colloquial language, the use of idioms and slang. So the more regional, the more specific for a geographic location, the more difficult for a student to understand. So that's why when we watch, for example, British television, it's not as easy to understand as American television because we have grown up with American television, so we know more slang and idiomatic expressions, whereas for British, we don't know so much. Rate of delivery, for example, fluency and rate. So the more proficient the speaker, the faster they're going to speak. So the more difficult for the student to understand. Yeah. Do you notice, or do you recall how you understand your teachers? It's not because your teachers speak slow or anything. It's because you grow accustomed to the rate of speaking of that person. So for you, it's easily comprehensible. But when you listen to a new person, then it's harder to understand, at least for a few minutes or a few hours, let's say. Okay, so stress, rhythm, and intonation, that's another important difficulty that presents to students. Normally, let's say that Spanish it's not flat, but it's flatter than English. In Spanish, we stress every word, which makes it difficult to then stress only content words in English, which is, requested or required. So for students, that's really hard to imitate. So the thing about all these difficulties is that we have to give students the opportunities to practice all of these things so they don't become, or they don't continue being difficulties for them. And once again, interaction, it's one of the most important aspects of communication, but also one of the hardest. So we have to create opportunities for students to interact naturally in the classroom, to negotiate meaning, to have authentic tasks. That's why when we have role plays, it's important for students to have a specific role so they can think about what they would say in a certain situation. There are different types of classroom speaking performance. As you can see on the slide, we have imitative, intensive, responsive, right? In the imitative type of classroom speaking performance, we focus on a particular element of language. We drill. This is something that can be, for example, done in grammar tasks when we are trying to get accuracy out of students, or in this audiolingual method type of task when the teacher said, "Repeat after me." Intensive, we have performance designed to practice some phonological or grammatical aspect of the language. So even though it's not drilling, it's not empty drilling, it still has a very strong emphasis on grammar. So for example, let's say that we want to practice asking yes/no questions. So we give the students, the time to write the questions, and then we give them the time to practice saying those questions. Responsive, short replies to teacher or student-initiated questions or comments. Here's, for example, an exercise like Tingo Tango, when I have my students ask and answer a question to each other. As you see, we are increasing in the level of freedom for students to perform their tasks. So the following would be transactional, where extended forms of responsive language, a more dialogic nature to the speaking task. So in here, even though there is a model, students have a more extended role. Then we have interpersonal, which are dialogues for maintaining social relationships. So in here, student is freer to produce and to create, and the extensive is something bigger. It's speeches or reports or summaries, monologues, is where the student has to prepare something longer and bigger. It's not conversational, but it's actually a presentation type of thing. So what are the principles for designing speaking techniques? Use techniques covering the spectrum of learner needs. Try to provide students with everything according to their learning style. Provide intrinsically motivating techniques. It's, of course, something that is interesting for you as a teacher might not be interesting for your students. So it's important to find out what they like and to interest them into the topics that we are preparing for class. Encourage the use of authentic language in meaningful contexts. So not so much the Mary goes to the bank type of exercise, but try to put students in real life situations. Provide appropriate feedback and correction. Feedback and correction are very important, but are very difficult to do, because normally if we overcorrect students, we will have quiet students who don't want to participate because they are afraid of being corrected. But if we don't correct whatsoever, then we'll give them a wrong sense of correctness. Yeah? So we have to balance it. Principles, we have some more. Capitalize on the natural link between listening and speaking. So always try to have activities that are mixed. That's why we are going to work on integrating the skills, because we not always speak only. We listen first and then we speak, right? So the speeches and extended presentations are one type of speaking task, but most commonly we will be responding to something we listen to. So it's important to generate these kind of activities for students. Give students opportunities to initiate oral communication. This is important. Try to always give them, the opportunity to talk, even if it's at an A1 level. Students can always say something. And encourage the development of speaking strategies, conversational rules and structures, survival and repair strategies, real talk. Have students try speaking in real conversations. There are different for example, different websites where students can go to practice, something like VoiceThread or VoxelPop, where they can record themselves. There are chats. There are different things that we can promote in our classroom for students to do, especially for the introverted students that are not going to talk in class. Okay? So problem solvers, there are some activities that we can use in order to help our students solve problems in speaking that are use group work. It's always great. It's always great because students feel more comfortable. Base the activity on easy language, provide some baseline language, and then have students depart from there. Make a careful choice of topic and task to simulate interest. Once again, what is interesting for you not necessarily is interesting for students, so be careful about the selection. Give some instruction or training in discussion skills. Not only just generate the moment for students to speak, but also give some rules. Help them say, what do you say in this situation? How do you ask for your turn? How do you interrupt someone politely? Give them, this kind of transactional language. Keep students speaking the target language. We understand that we are in a bilingual context and the students might use Spanish, but try to make it a class culture that they use the target language so they can benefit more from the class time. Some classroom activities, role play, problem solving, information gap activities, where you complete a chart, telling stories, surveys, meeting and greeting, student presentation, moral dilemmas, etc. The internet is full of these kinds of activities now. So these are some references that you can check. You can also check Kit Folse's book on speaking. And so I hope that now you have an overall idea on how to think about speaking when you become a teacher. Alright, so you're ready for the next video.